So with book 13, we have a very thorough investigation of the mystery of death. And of all topics, this is the most deeply philosophical. This is the mystery that unavoidably raises questions, and the most urgent questions in our hearts. And so to have a guide such as Augustine for this particular investigation is, we couldn't do any better, actually. In the Confessions, book 4, we have that account Augustine gives of the death of his dear friend, and that causes a crisis in him. He says, I become a great question to myself. And death is a theme he tracks throughout his career. This is related to that thing which I noted last time, well, I've noted several times, that the mutability, the changeability, the transience of life, the goods of this world and how they pass away inevitably. This pathos saturates Augustine's writings, because I think he lived that melancholy in the most profound way. So in another place he says, everything is uncertain, only death is certain. And he goes on to say in another place, everything else about us, good as well as evil, is uncertain. When the child is conceived, perhaps it will be born, perhaps there will be a miscarriage. Perhaps the child will grow up, perhaps not. Perhaps it will grow old, perhaps not. Perhaps it will be rich, perhaps poor. Perhaps honored, perhaps humiliated. Perhaps it will have sons, perhaps not. And the same for whatever other good things you may name. Consider all evils there may be. For all everywhere it is true that perhaps they may be, perhaps not. But can you also say of someone, perhaps he will die, perhaps not? As soon as a man is born, it must at once and necessarily be said, he cannot escape death. It's a truism, and yet it's the most profound thing. So there we are in the mystery before us in this book. Plato and other classical philosophers had said, of course, that philosophy was the practice of dying. And I think in a very essential way, Augustine would agree that Christianity is that same practice. And that how we do it, how we learn to die, is going to distinguish, is going to be one of those things, maybe the basic thing that distinguishes how the two cities carry on in the world. If we live our lives anxious, and anxious in a way that always can be traced back to death, one way or another, that veil that covers all the peoples, as we hear in Isaiah. If the thought of a zero-sum game, that the games we play in this world are it's ruthless. You have to, the dominance hierarchies, right? That we have to beat others to keep our head above water. That's the earthly city. That's the game of the world. That's the way of the world. So a different way of looking at death is to see there's a boundary here, the ultimate boundary, the one that all of us are going to have to cross, and everything's different afterwards, one way or another. Either there's nothing, or there's something completely different. But one way or another, you cross that boundary, there's something that's fundamentally going to change. If that boundary marks the distinction between this world and another world, then a city that is located in that other world, heaven, the city of God, it's going to have a different ethos. It's going to have a different politics. It's going to be lived out in a different way. And if we can somehow bring that ethos to our lives here in time and on earth, then you get something like the kingdom of love, of warning. And that's the claim anyway in Christianity, even if many of us Christians don't live it out well. And that's the whole question of the mixture of citizenships, that earthly citizenship, heavenly citizenship, it's not neatly parsed out. I want to read in this respect a passage from Ratzinger. I think his greatest book actually is this one on eschatology. It's a masterpiece. And he says, as we know, people run up against the fact that life is not at their disposal in more forms than those of such physical limitations as sickness bring home to us. The same thing happens in the central region of the human landscape, our intimate ordination towards being loved. Love is the soul's true nourishment, yet this food, which of all substances we most need, is not something we can produce for ourselves. One must wait for it. The only way to make absolutely certain that one will not receive it is to insist on procuring it by oneself. And once again, this essential dependence can generate anger. One can attempt to shake it off and reduce it to the satisfaction of those needs that require no adventure of the spirit or the heart for their filling. Conversely, we can accept this situation of dependence and keep ourselves trustingly open to the future, in the confidence that the power which has so determined us will not deceive us. And so it turns out that the confrontation with physical death is actually a confrontation with the basic constitution of human existence. It places before us a choice to accept either the pattern of love or the pattern of power. Now, I think it's appropriate for many reasons to quote Ratzinger. He's a very Augustinian thinker, profoundly shaped by Augustine. That's the question I think death does put before us, and I think it's put by Augustine. Will we live life grasping to secure our own position in the world, that is to amass as much power as possible, libido dominandi, right, the lust for domination? Or is it to take on, or will death teach us to take on the stance of the one who must wait for the good to advene, to come, right? The stance of faith, presumably, the stance of one who would be loved and who would love, because love is not something that can be manufactured. It is not something that can be disposed of according to one's own will. It is something that is out of our control. And that is the whole proposition Augustine would have us realize about the two cities. The earthly city is the game we play in order to have it all according to our will. And the heavenly city, the city of God, is a different kind of game, one in which we allow a force greater and better than ourselves dispose things. So that's the and I hope these thoughts you find also poignant and therefore provocative, because today I would like to discuss these issues both from the text, but of course, in general, it's always good. So this is why you don't have to read every single page, even though it's better the more you read, to participate in the conversation, because these are things, when Augustine talks about whatever he talks about, he means it in a way that has the most profound human significance, and we can all enter into that philosophically, even without faith, even without having read all of the text. Now, one other thing I want to note in this book, and it's something I didn't quite say, I think with enough insistence last time, he does take up a theme, I believe he's continuing a theme from the previous book, which is the books do bleed into each other, and explicitly so. He ends the chapter and says, I've run out of space, I've got to move on to another book. They're all linked. That proposition I put forward, the hypothesis that Augustine, as the quintessential Latin thinker, the architect of the Western mind in the most profound sense, I think, he's insisting on the need to break the Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern quote unquote thought form of cyclicality, of circularity, of there being not just this life, but maybe an eternal recurrence of this life, reincarnation, transmigration, or as we have it in the Indian religions, right? The wheel of samsara. That religious pathos is there, and one can broadly say it's an Eastern thing. And it's there in Platonism, and in Christian Platonism is represented by Origen. So why does Augustine keep coming back to the Platonists and to Origen? Origen's still here. That kind of odd last chapter of this book, it really is aimed at Origen. Why is this so important for Augustine? Well, I think partly because he loves the Platonists, and I think he recognizes how great Origen is. But he also sees that there's something very dangerous about, so first, that they're closer to the truth than other forms of thought, certainly the Platonists, other than the other pagans. But there's the danger, and the danger, I think we can use that last chapter 24 to try to typify it. Augustine wants to be very clear. In the beginning, God created humans so the prelapsarian means before the fall. So I'll use that shorthand. The prelapsarian body was an animal body, according to Augustine. That is, it true flesh like ours. There's no difference between before and after the fall and the quality of the flesh. What was different was that before the fall, there was an extrinsic immortality. For Augustine, it wasn't intrinsic. It was God's plan to keep this body, which naturally falls apart. So in itself, any animal body is going to fall apart. But the original plan was in the beginning, before the fall, that our bodies would be held together by eating the tree of life. So there would be an extrinsic medicine, as it were, to maintain our bodily integrity. And also there would be that relationship with that intimate relationship with God, which we call sanctifying grace in the later tradition, that is going to keep our spirits from falling apart. So later dogma will talk about the gifts of integrity and immortality. Okay, these preternatural gifts, as what we said. Okay, after the fall, death is a punishment. Always and everywhere, death is a punishment. Augustine is very insistent on that. And so we have to think about that. We can think there are other very good Catholics who don't talk about it this way. Tolkien talks about the gift of death, right? So Augustine, that's not his position. It's a punishment. It's bad. He talks about the martyrs, though, as taking a bad thing and transforming it into something good. Living out death after the death of Christ, or in the death in the cross, is a transformation of something evil to bring good out of it. But in itself, it is again that thing about Augustine. He has deep melancholy, and it is something that tears at his heart. So he wants to make clear that the beginning was the animal body, and then after the resurrection, it will be a spiritual body, which does not mean that this is going to become something wispy. It's the same flesh, but then it's animated now not by the soul first, it's animated by the Spirit of God. That's what spiritual means. And he's getting that out of Paul, like 1 Corinthians 15. So what's different is that Alpha and Omega. So in chapter 24 of this book, he's fighting Origen, who's saying, well, he's suggesting at least that in the beginning, there was a spiritual body. And what does that do? It eliminates the difference between Alpha and Omega. So what I'm proposing here is that what's at stake in chapter 24, which seems to me, at first I was very puzzled, but I'm thinking this is my hypothesis, that Western linearity needs Alpha and Omega to be different. It's very Eastern Christian. There's a tendency there to have Alpha and Omega be equal. In Latin Christianity, Alpha and Omega are different, and that allows, therefore, a linear development. That's what I think is at stake here. So I'm just putting that out there as a hypothesis, and we can test this. So I'm trying to indicate what is important in this chapter, in this whole book. Death raises the basic questions about how are we going to live. Will we live as citizens of the earthly city or citizens of the city of God? And the other great theme in this book, of course, is how good embodiment is. And that again is a way of reinforcing, if I may, the Western. And again, I think that there's too loose the talk, and maybe I'm doing it too, about East and West, but I do think there is a Western thing. And I think Augustine is the one who really uh, epitomizes it. So again, the other big dispute with the Platonists, including the Christian Platonist origin, is a defense of the goodness of this world and of this body. And that's the other thing that we have here. So how can you both, there, you see how that ratchets up the poignance of death, poignancy of death. This is good. This world is good. There's a veil cast by death, woven by death. There's also all of that malice that our abuse of free will brings into the world. But still, underneath the perversion of the world is the world that is good. And to be a citizen of the city of God is to somehow live in the truth of this world as that good world. But we're still, if you're somehow living that life, and yet still we die, still the ones we love die, still the good things of this world pass away. One has to somehow develop spiritually in a way that's able to withstand those shearing forces. And I believe that's part of the task of the city of God itself, is to try to make it possible for us to stand as faithful witnesses to a good God and a good world, despite all of the terrors of death and the transience. Okay, so I hope you all have lots to say.